All right, today we're diving into a story that's all about faith, miracles, and, well, a really, really long nap. It's a tale you might have heard before, but the source we're digging into today throws a huge curveball. It suggests the origins of this story are not what they seem, and it presents a historical puzzle that really makes you think.
So, in Islam, there's this really beloved and powerful story about a miracle. It's called the Ashab Al-Kahf, which means the companions of the cave. I mean, for millions of Muslims, this is a cornerstone story from the Qur'an. It's all about God's protection and having unwavering faith, even when you're facing persecution.
But, and here's the big but. This is where our source material for today comes in and asks a pretty provocative question. What if that story isn't originally Islamic? What if its roots are somewhere else entirely? The author lays out this historical mystery that honestly is pretty fascinating to look into.
Okay, so before we get into the author's big argument, let's just do a quick refresher. We need to make sure we're all on the same page about the story as it's told in the Quran.
It's a really cool story, right? You've got this group of young guys who are being persecuted for their belief in one God. So they go hide out in a cave. And with them is their dog. They all fall asleep for a very long time. We're talking hundreds of years. When they finally wake up, the world is completely changed. They send one guy into town to get food, and the old coin he uses gives them away, revealing this incredible miracle to a whole new world.
All right, so we've got the story down. Now let's get to the main point of the source we're looking at today. The author makes a pretty bold claim that this exact story existed way before the Quran was ever revealed. And they don't just say it existed. They point to a specific version. It's a famous Christian legend known as the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus. And according to our source, this is the original. This is the story that came first. This idea right here is the foundation for everything else we're about to talk about. And check out this timeline the source lays out. This is where it gets really interesting. They say the actual event, the persecution of these Christians, happened way back around 250 CE. Then, the story gets written down as a Christian legend around 500 CE. Now think about that. That's more than 100 years before the Quran was revealed. This sequence of dates is absolutely critical to the author's entire point. And here's what the source claims is the smoking gun, the core difference. Look at this quote from that early Christian version. They're not just saying, we believe in one God. They're saying, we believed in the living God and in his son Jesus Christ. That specific phrase, that confession, is what the author builds their entire case on. So, okay, if we follow this logic, if we assume for a second that one story came from the other, the obvious next question is, what changed? What's different between the two versions? Let's dive into the side-by-side comparison the author provides.
Well, the biggest change, the author says, is all about theology. The Christian version is laser-focused on one thing, Jesus Christ as the Son of God. But the Quranic version, the focus shifts. It's now about a more general monotheism, what's known as Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God, and about rejecting idols. And, crucially, any specific mention of Jesus is gone.
This table really breaks it all down. Look at the bottom row first. The basic plot points, the cave, the long sleep, the dog, the old coins, they're all the same. It's the same story framework. But then, as you move up the table, you see what the author is pointing to. The whole theological core gets swapped out. The confession is different. The key figure of Jesus is no longer there. The central message changes from being about Christ to being purely about one God. And all of this comparison, it leads to what the author calls the paradox. This is really the heart of their entire argument. It's a kind of catch-22, a two-sided problem that they say is really tough to get around. It really boils down to this one question that the author puts to you, the reader. Was the original story, the Christian one, just a nice piece of fiction, a legend? Or did it actually happen? Was it a real historical event? Because according to the author, whichever way you answer, you run into a huge theological problem. And here they are, the two sides of that dilemma. Let's take the first path. Let's say the original story was just fiction, a made-up legend. Well, if that's the case, the author argues, then the Quran has included a Christian fable and presented it as historical fact. Okay, now let's take the other path. What if the story is true? What if it really happened? Well then, the miracle, this incredible divine act, happened to people whose whole belief was centered on Jesus as the Son of God. So the miracle would seem to validate that very specific Christian belief.
So you can see the stakes here, right? According to the source, if you go down the fiction path, it raises questions about the Quran's divine origin and perfect preservation. But if you go down the truth path, well, that's just as tricky from an Islamic viewpoint, because it would mean God performed a miracle that affirmed a belief that Jesus is the Son of God, which is a belief the Quran itself directly contradicts.
And that brings us to the author's final conclusion. And they really don't hold back. They leave the reader with one last, very pointed idea to chew on. So, to wrap up the author's position, they conclude that the Quran seems to have borrowed a Christian story, but they claim it censored the central message of that story. And in doing so, it created what they call an irreconcilable paradox, a puzzle with no easy answer. And this is how the whole analysis ends, not with a neat and tidy answer, but with a challenge. Just 3 words, a simple call to action that basically puts the ball in your court. It's a pretty powerful way to end an argument that weaves together history, faith, and scripture, leaving you with a lot to think about.